So if you are able to bring the software engineer into the process and the data developer can differentiate between here's the data we have in the warehouse and it's very, very easy for me to get and join that. And here's the data that we don't have in the warehouse. And I think a software engineer should implement it from a production system. That's actually going to speed up the time it takes to deliver a lot of these data sets. And you're going to be able to trust the data radically more. And your warehouse is going to be more scalable.
I'm thrilled to have our guest, Chad Sanderson, on our podcast here today. Chad is head of data platform at Convoy. Welcome, Chad. You want to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Jason. Happy to be here. I am currently, as you said, the head of data platform at Convoy. I work in a digital freight industry. We focus on owning the entire data pipeline for a very complex freight lifecycle. And that's everything from event instrumentation, ETL, ELT, storing data, and then building applications on top of that data like experimentation and machine learning pipelines as well. Before that, I was working in artificial intelligence and big data at Microsoft. And then prior to that, I was working in big data and experimentation at scale at companies like Sephora and Subway.
Great, Chad. Well, thanks for that. For our listeners, Chad and I were speaking the other day, just about some of the general challenges around how data is actually applied and modeled in the real world today. Anyone on LinkedIn has probably come across some of Chad's posts. They're both very opinionated, and also lots of engagement and interest because I really do think Chad is onto some real challenges in the marketplace today that very much I think will speak to anyone listening to this episode of the podcast. And today we're going to be focusing on a real challenge every business faces practically around how to make the most of their data, how to put forward their data strategy, and with this, just think about not necessarily the technology, but really the people and the processes that drive the broader data systems, and to really take data from collection into action and real use. When we sort of look at the stakeholders involved in making data work, there are really three different functions. First, are the folks who collect the data. Folks who build the websites, who build the applications, who build the software that's embedded in the trucks. As in the case of Convoy. And these are the folks who are ultimately tasked with making sure data is collected properly. And there's an adage in machine learning. I spent many years of my career, building machine learning algorithms, and that's something called garbage in, garbage out. And if the data isn't collected in a high quality fashion, if it's not collected carefully, then nothing downstream matters. The first function that we'll be talking about today is your software engineering, and your software engineers who are tasked with making sure the data is collected, correctly. The second function, of course, is your data team. Your data team is responsible for aggregating the data, setting the strategy around how it's collected, and also making sure that it's that the strategy around how it's used, is clearly in place as well. And then finally, the third, and really lifeline, that makes it all successful is the business stakeholder. The business stakeholders, your remit ultimately is one of, making sure that the application is defined, the real world problems and revenue or cost opportunities are in front of them, and then from their collaboration with the data team to make sure that the right components are in place, are modeled, and are collected. So first, Chad, maybe you can sort of just speak to my description and what I missed and and how that fits into what you're seeing in the market.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate description. I think there's also, the consumer is really interesting. Sort of the final step is quite varied. I think there are some consumers of data that are pretty technical. These are data scientists that are building ML models, they're building experiments, they're running relatively complex analysis. Or it could be someone like a product manager that just needs that data to manifest in the table and they want to slice it and dice it across a few interesting dimensions. Or it could be someone in sales and marketing that just needs like a single metric. So it's quite a wide range of customers and personas. And that means that the way that data needs and data requests sort of flow bidirectionally actually needs to be generic enough so that it can be tailored to all of those personas. And I think that that's a pretty difficult problem to solve because there's just so many different use cases and needs for data. The other thing I would say, I think your framework is exactly correct on the upstream side, on the sort of data producers and the data developers. And the really interesting thing about the system of these sort of three key stakeholder groups is that, in today's modern data ecosystem, they don't really talk to each other and they're in complete isolation. I'm sure we're going to get a little bit more into that.
100%. And for listeners who may have listened to a previous podcast with Michael Katz, who's CEO of mParticle, as it relates to customer data, mParticle is, of course, focused on solving this first leg of the problem and making sure data is collected in a high quality fashion. And Simon is then focused around marketing and customer experience applications around the third leg of the problem. I guess to sort of contextualize that with anyone who may have listened to that episode. Another thing I'll add, which is super interesting for a business stakeholder, they may not look at a data scientist as a consumer. I know in my framework, when I teed it out, I sort of generalize the end consumer role into anyone who might use data in any way, shape, or form. But it is very interesting, and certainly being having spent many years of my life as a machine learning researcher, it is interesting that that they too are in this bucket of data consumers.
Yeah, I think one of the differentiating factors of each of the three groups that you described is that the consumer fundamentally doesn't really care how the data is generated. They have a need. They can often express what is the data that they want. In most cases, they can certainly express an English definition of what is it that they actually need. Like, I need to see the total number of shipments divided by the total number of contracts that Convoy bid for, and that will give us a ratio of like what is actually the delivered shipments to total potential shipments that we could have won. I know that I need that metric, but I don't know where that data comes from. I don't know what sort of production systems need to emit that data. I have no idea if there needs to be a schema definition or not, or what tables need to exist. The second layer, sort of like the data developer, data engineer, business intelligence engineer, they are technically producers in their own right as well, right? They're thinking about how do we generate tables and data assets that solve business problems. They're sort of the nexus of the core of this entire model. And then on the upstream side, you have software engineers that are basically totally removed from the business problem. And they're just thinking about how do I instrument or implement or gather this data most effectively that has been asked of me. So that's sort of the way that I like to think about these three buckets, and it makes it pretty simple to place various customer personas into each one.
Yeah, that's great. And in a second, I'm going to ask you where things break down. But first I'll sort of just talk a bit of I'll talk about an analogy that I've actually been using for many years. I put this on LinkedIn yesterday, but for the last 7-8 years, I'm a Cornell grad for my undergrad, and I teach a data-driven a data course for the product development course at Cornell Tech's new campus in New York. And there's an analogy I like to use around data modeling as it relates to security footage at a shopping mall. So imagine a set of a dozen cameras placed inside, and in the parking areas of a shopping mall. From that you could get actually a pretty rich data set. That describes who's at the mall, what kind of cars they drive to get there. Do they go in through an anchor store? Do they go in through the food court? But one of the challenges around data modeling is if you take that footage in a vacuum, and as a data engineer, you try to extract every piece of information, you're going to be in a very tough place. Which is why at the end of the day, whether your end consumer is someone who's affecting some sort of machine learning application to do image recognition, or a business user who's trying to figure out, we're trying to upgrade the food hall. When do people come in? Why do they come in? At what times? And then, when they're done eating, what do they do after that? Do they go to the high-end shops, or do they go to the dollar stores? So maybe the first sort of specific question I'll ask for you, Chad, around how it breaks is how do you translate and make sure that the business problem is translated into actually a set of data requirements, such that something that is, at least approximates the right data is there. And what does that look like? And what's your sort of guidance for doing that effectively from your perspective?
So I can give you my general guidance, and then I can tell you how we do this at Convoy. The general guidance is it's important to capture all of the data. If you want to do exploration, if you're not sure how various entities connect to each other, if there's a lot of unknowns in the data and you maybe want to explore those relationships in a way that isn't necessarily explicitly tied to semantic meaning. And this does have some use cases, right? It is possible that if you try to model only the things that you explicitly need, you're going to miss some information. And for maybe a data scientist that just wants to go in and do a lot of research investigation, that's not ideal. So I think you actually need both models. You need to be able to enable this sort of flexibility and exploration, but you also need to be able to tie the data to very sort of clear requirements, as you said, and those requirements should be tied to semantic meaning. I think this is where it is very important for any data professionals to think about the workflow, how the life cycle of a data request. Generally, what we found at Convoy is that this starts in the form of plain English. There's some human being, some consumer at the very end of the pipeline that says, I need this metric, I need this data set, or I need this information. That plain English needs to then get translated into a table or to a set of events expressed as schema. So this could be passed around for a while within the organization before that is finalized. There are different teams within Convoy, for example. We have a shipper team. We have a carrier team that focuses on sort of our trucks. We have a team that focuses on ETAs, a team that focuses on facilities. And each of those teams are going to have the most knowledge about what data they already have and what data needs to be explicitly collected from our production systems in order to deliver whatever the final outcome is that the consumer has actually requested. So what we try to facilitate at Convoy is making that workflow very simple and very straightforward for everyone. We provide a template to our data consumers to say, here's where you can capture the English, the written business context for the question that you have. From there, the ask flows to the data developer, the BIE or analytics engineer that's on their team. That person then says, okay, in order for us to deliver this question, here is the table that needs to exist. I want a table, and there needs to be a shipment ID and a shipper ID, and I want the time that the shipment arrived at the facility, the facility name where it arrived, and so on and so forth. And then from there, they identify, okay, who are the people that we need to talk to? Who are the other in business intelligence engineers that own that data that can potentially generate the data sets that power this final table? The asks then distribute to them. And those data developers then say, okay, I'm being asked to generate a table. That table is going to feed into a final data set. A lot of this data I already have, so I can construct it myself, but some of it is missing. So in the case of your security camera example, someone might have a request where they need to capture, I don't know, like the last time, the time of day that the last person exited the building. And we need to get that from a particular team. Maybe we're not collecting that data explicitly right now. That they would go to their software engineer and say, hey, I want to have a new real world event that's captured as schema that's called, last facility exit. And here's all the properties I want to collect about that last facility exit, including, what was the time that it happened, which exit was it at, which store was it at, and so on and so forth. The software engineer receives that request. They can go and implement it. It's quite straightforward. The data will flow into the warehouse as JSON. It's parsed into a source table, and then the reverse flow then happens, right? Then the data developer says, now I can incorporate this into my table. They pass that table along to the final sort of data developer. They integrate all the data sets that they need, and they provide it to the data consumer. And you have all of this like rich context that's been captured from the initial request. All the data is very, very high quality, and it's owned by the right person. It's not just like mashed together by someone at the very end of the pipeline. That's the process we follow at Convoy.
That's great. It makes a ton of sense. And it's a great example with that. And maybe we can touch for a few minutes, Chad, on really the divide across people, process, and systems in making this happen. I know both of us sort of share a common perspective that there's this too much data technology out in the marketplace today. That's trying to solve problems that maybe exist, but but maybe don't. When you sort of look at this broader life cycle, and I know listening to how it works at Convoy, it seems like there's a lot of process. How do you break that down, and what's your perspective on really what drives the bus? And furthermore, for our listeners today who might be in marketing teams or trying to get into a better cadence with their data teams, what sorts of processes might they be able to put in place to make this more fluid?
Yes. So absolutely. I think that the core of building data warehouses, of making data requests, of creating data contracts, like at its core, these are all processes. However, I do think that at some level, in order to gain adoption at scale across your business, that process needs to be simple. It needs to be really easy. It needs to be super straightforward, and it needs to be very, very fast. So this is where I think that technology has a role to play. The technology can't necessarily automate the job for you, but it can make it much easier to do the work. And I think a lot of the current technologies in the modern data stack are point solutions that focus on a part of this end-to-end workflow. So for example, if you think about data discovery and data catalogs and how those are typically used, a data catalog becomes important when you're searching for data. So there's an assumption that a request has already happened, right? There's some person that knows, okay, I've been asked to go and answer a business question. Now I'm going to go into a catalog. I'm going to try to find out where the data exists. And then it sort of stops there. But there's a lot of other follow-on questions that happen after that, right? Like, what happens if I can't find the data that I need? What happens if the data does not exist at all? What happens if there's no owning team attached to the data? What happens if there's no semantic context? So the reason I think that a lot of the point solutions in the modern data stack fail is because they don't look at the end-to-end data lifecycle. They don't look at it as a workflow and as a process, which means that teams have to, for a relatively straightforward set of behaviors, you have to jump from tool to tool to tool to tool to tool. And eventually that creates gaps because these tools don't communicate to each other, right? They don't talk. And so these like data requests and the data needs are not inherited up and down the value chain, which actually makes implementing in the process quite a challenging thing to do. So that's where I see the role is. What I would really love to see from data products are things that allow the workflow itself to be interoperable and to focus on, how do we deliver all the various stages of this data lifecycle instead of, here's a point solution for doing one like very, very specific thing. So that's sort of the question on the product side. Then if you're on the marketing side, if you're on the sales side, how do you implement a process like this? Well, the good thing is data people and software people actually really like getting good requirements. What they don't like is when someone files 10 or 20 different tickets at a service desk, and then they throw it over the fence and they say, hey, I need this data by tomorrow. And then they have to run out and they have to scramble and put a bunch of stuff together and give you a dashboard. And that dashboard answers, 5 of your questions out of the 100 questions you actually have, which result in sort of this endless stream of dashboards over time. What I think everybody would appreciate a lot more is if on the consumer side, you provided context about what are all of the questions that you're trying to answer. Why are you trying to answer them? And then providing context about how the business actually works and having a relationship with your data partner. There's going to be questions that they have where they say, hey, listen, I don't really understand what this means. I don't understand how this process works. If it's a relationship, you're going to find that the data developer will be able to build out like a much more robust, much more sort of fleshed out and comprehensive system that satisfies a lot of those use cases. The other thing I think people need to do is to start incorporating software engineers into their data development workflow. What happens, I'll say like 95 to 99% of the time, is that most of these requests stop at the data developer. So we'll say, hey, data scientist or analyst or whoever, or data engineer, here's the thing that I need. They will go out, they'll build a dashboard, and then it kind of stops there. And so you get this like infinite, loop where you're just sort of bouncing back and forth between this one person. They get really frustrated. When really a lot of the time that data developers spend generating these data sets is because the data they need is not being captured from production systems. So they have to write hundreds and hundreds of lines of SQL and case statements in order to infer when these real world things actually exist. So if you are able to bring the software engineer into the process and the data developer can differentiate between, here's the data we have in the warehouse, and it's very, very easy for me to get and join that. And here's the data that we don't have in the warehouse, and I think a software engineer should implement it from a production system. That's actually going to speed up the time it takes to deliver a lot of these data sets, and you're going to be able to trust the data radically more, and your warehouse is going to be more scalable.
Yep. And I'm sure every one of our listeners, on the business side or the marketing side in particular, has been in a situation where they absolutely needed a number, filed it last minute, to get that from, their data resources. And to Chad's point, the biggest challenge, outside of that, being interruptive in work that, doesn't necessarily align with, where things need to go is, if the data is not there, then it's this awful process of triangulation, while you try to infer, a specific metric, that, isn't actually there to begin with. One thing you said on the people side, which, is super interesting and really resonated. The first is, for me, having sat on both sides of the table, built data teams, data infrastructure, data science, and now, having brought a product to market that works very closely with, marketing and customer experience, folks who own the customer experience, being able to triage the business problem into the data requirements, is more than a process issue. It's a matter of sitting down and asking, what data, might I be able to collect that can help me understand, whether or not folks, entering the food court might buy a $40 steak at 7 p.m. as opposed to just wanting a breakfast burrito when they enter the mall at 9 a.m. Before they go and do a quick few errands. And really just thinking through that top down, is critical because most of the data that you think you might want might not be there, but there may be other types of data that is. And furthermore, developing these relationships ultimately can help build a generalizable data model that can then be used to also answer adjacent problems or other things that might come as a result of the answer to your first problem. And so I think really, having that codified is critical. Because at the end of the day, the biggest challenge we see in the market is, at least that we see from our perspective, is folks just not having enough foresight around what data they actually need. And as a result, there's this massive gap between the two sides, and a world in which 10 requests come up, because we need a board report tomorrow morning. Certainly doesn't help that at all. Another point around people, which also really resonated, is look, if processes are hard, then people just aren't going to do them. And as far as marketing tools go today, so many tools, it's just too hard to get new data in. So as a result, marketing strategies are limited to the 10, 12, or 15 fields on the customer they might have. But if instead there are processes in place that were backed by workflows that were simple, we've seen how this can really drive a material change, in how people orient data and leverage data to drive data-driven outcomes.
Absolutely. I think the simplicity is extraordinarily important for adoption. When I used to work in a field called CRO, conversion rate optimization, there's a concept there called friction. And friction essentially means, how difficult is it for a customer to accomplish any given task? And there's no limitation on what friction represents. It could be technological friction, it could be process-based friction, it could be organizational friction, or it could be educational friction, right? Like, in order for me to accomplish some particular outcome, I need to go and learn about how my data model works, right? That is a form of friction. And the more friction points that exist, you can think of friction like literally, like if a car is driving on a road, you have friction points. What's going to happen is the car goes a lot slower. It's going to take longer to reach its destination, if at all. And so the more friction points that exist in any system, the more difficult it is to get a customer to a conversion event. Right. So that's when I was working on websites and we were selling like e-commerce products and things like that. But you can apply that same model to any outcome that you would like to achieve as if it was a conversion event. Like maybe my conversion event as a data platform leader is I want our business stakeholders to take a more active role in thinking about the data lifecycle and business context. And if it's really difficult to do that, if there's no surface where they can draw those connections easily, if they can't do it in an iterative way, if they don't have insight into how the business actually works and how data flows, all of those things are going to make it really, really hard for them to come up with this business insight off the top of their head. Maybe they're going to have to go write a Word document. They're going to have to store all this business and semantic information in a single document. They're going to have to maintain it and keep up with it. All of that is a cost. It's a tax. And when people have another job that they need to do, that tax becomes extraordinarily prohibitive. It's they oftentimes you sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater and just say it's not worth my time. I think that is an extremely important concept that I wish more folks who build third-party data products really thought about. Is not just what is the onboarding use case for my particular tool, but what is the friction for the workflow? How hard is it to do this end-to-end workflow? And yeah, maybe my tool makes a part of that easy, but what about everything else? And if the everything else is really hard, and your product sits in the middle of that process, it doesn't actually matter how easy it is because everything around it is still completely broken and incredibly painful.
Yep, no, 100%. And we're near the bottom of the show. So, final question for you, Chad. This is a relatively new question we've incorporated into the podcast. If you could replay this conversation with anyone other than me, anyone in leadership across a large or small organization for that matter, who would it be and why?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to big tech companies like Google and Twitter and Facebook, historically, the problems that they have focused on in data as large scale, high volume, high traffic organizations has been one of cost optimization, right? You have a tremendous data flowing into the system. You're paying an enormous amount in storage. You're paying an enormous amount in compute. And so they really focused on optimizing their cost and ensuring that what they were paying for those two expenditures were not ballooning significantly out of control. But what we're talking about right now isn't really a problem about cost. I guess it can be extrapolated to cost in some ways. If you make something simpler, then you also make it cheaper. But it's fundamentally about complexity and usability and the accessibility of the data to solve a variety of business problems. So I would love to talk to someone who works in a company that is at the intersection of technology and the real world, where you have a lot of complex workflows. You have a variety of life cycles across different entity types. So maybe you have a logistical life cycle. You have life cycle of a payout system, a life cycle of a return. You have products that don't just manifest into a e-commerce environment, but they actually have to be stocked and they can get out of date. Someone has to deliver them. They have to be picked up from a farm and purchased and requisitioned and everything else. I think in businesses like that is where these conversations have an enormous amount of value. So the CTO of Walmart is Suresh Kumar. I would love to have a conversation with him about everything we're talking about today. I think these types of processes and changing how we think about data requests and data management would have a huge impact on businesses, like I said, that sit at this interaction between technology and the real world.
Got it. Well, that makes a ton of sense, Chad, and it's sort of a great answer. And thanks for coming on to the podcast today and sharing your wisdom with us. When I sort of reflect on this conversation, it's all about the so what of data. Ultimately, data needs to exist to serve the business application. And today there are just real challenges in affecting that. As far as Simon Data is related, the issues around process were really sort of key to how we view the market. A quick part of our strategy, I guess, and a quick plug for part of our platform is really how we think about integration, and continuity from data infrastructure, the cloud data warehouse, into our platform. And to the point I made a few moments ago, if the workflows around enabling data and bring them into your application so you can use them are simple, then people, as a result, will there'll be less friction and they'll adopt them more. But with that being said, Chad, maybe you can tell our listeners a bit more about. I think you have a Substack and certainly some social efforts going on. So anyone who wants to keep up with what you're saying, how they can find you.
You can. I write a lot. I put out a lot of content on LinkedIn, so you can find me just at linkedin.com/in/Chad-Sanderson. And then I also write relatively frequently on my newsletter. It's called the Data Products Newsletter, and you can get there through dataproducts.substack.com. And that's just DATAPRODUCTS.
Great. And thank you to everyone listening to this episode of the Data Unlocked podcast today. And if you'd like to learn more about Simon Data, please visit us on the web at simondata.com or email us at hello@simondata.